Please welcome our moderator, editor-at-large of Bloomberg Television, Erik Schatzker, and his panelists, President of the New York Stock Exchange Group, Stacey Cunningham, CEO of UBS Group, Piyush Gupta, Managing Director and Vice Chairman of PIMCO, John Studzinski, and Chairman of UBS Group, Axel A.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with my lively and highly engaged panel and to see you here this morning. Before we begin, I do want to remind you that you have the apps. You've been using them already to answer the panels, or answer the polls, but you can also use them to send questions for the panel. And I'll be looking for your questions as they come in, and I'll try to weave them into our conversation. So please engage with me, engage with the panel, and we'll make it collaborative. We have a great question to answer today. It is a question that every CEO, every CIO, and every boardroom around the world should be asking itself. Is there a new paradigm for global business? We have a pretty good idea of what the old paradigm was. We could call it globalization. And that paradigm had some highly identifiable characteristics. Free movement of capital, for example. Trade liberalization, supply chain expansion, cross-border interdependence and multilateralism. Also, resource exploitation, wage stagnation to a degree, institutional authority. It sure feels to me, and I think to others here, that that paradigm has changed awfully fast. I would point to, among other things, inflation, ESG, and crypto as evidence that something is happening. So I'd like to begin by asking our panel, do you believe that there is a new paradigm for global business? If so, what are its dominant characteristics? Are they different from the old ones, and if so, how? And if there isn't a new paradigm for global business, why not? Stacey, I'd like you to start the conversation.
Well, there's definitely a new paradigm for global business, and I'm not sure that any one of us up here can tell you exactly what that's going to look like just yet, because there are so many unknowns, and there are so many things happening at the same time, and their interaction is really what is going to decide and determine what the future of business looks like. And so many of the topics that Erik mentioned are related to that and woven into that, but it's other things as well, and some of them are driven by the consumer wanting a more direct impact on their choices, employees wanting a more direct impact on how they decide and what they want to do, what flexibility they want, the wages, where they're working, what industries they're in. I mean, there's so many things happening at the same time, with also looking at the deglobalization of so many industries. So it's definitely going to change, but I'm not smart enough to tell you what it's going to look like.
Who is?
Well, Erik, I think we've also now, first of all, I think we've seen the dots, but we haven't, it's going to take us quite a few years to be able to connect the dots to see what the new paradigm looks like. I do think, though, following on Tracy's comment about the individual, I think one of the things, this whole debate about climate reaction, COVID is really the first major sustainability crisis, and it's game-changing. But I think that also reintroduces this whole discussion of the common good. Mm-hmm. And I think the expression of the common good is something we're very conscious of, but it varies culturally, and it's something that the Americans talk about, and it's obviously something now the Chinese very much talk about in the context of common prosperity and the recent plenum. So I think we need to add, to Stacey's point, the individual and this sort of me orientation, particularly and very much in the American economy, to the notion of the common good and how the new business model is going to address the common good.
So Erik, if I can come in. So first of all, I'm not in the camp of the world is deglobalizing, and maybe we'll talk about that separately. But I have two messages. First is, I don't think there's just a new paradigm for global business. I think there's a new paradigm for how we run the world. And that's a lot more consequential than how you run business. I think there are two big drivers which we need to be really cognizant of. One is we're trying to wean away from a fossil fuel, carbon-led economy, something we've created over the last 150 years, and very rapidly swing to a completely new economic construct. There's trillions and trillions of dollars of extant infrastructure investment which needs to be transitioned. That's no small feat. The second is, people haven't talked about it so much. Wang Qishan mentioned it. I think the impact of technology in the next decade is going to be completely game-changing. That includes Web3 with self-sovereign individuals and self-sovereign identities. It includes AI with artificial general intelligence increasingly allowing us to outsource our brains. And it includes a 5G world where holographic and 3D, etc., make virtual reality possible. I think when you couple this, these two pedals, I think the green pedal and the technology pedal, one consequence of this is going to be massive social redistribution. So the poor people, the poor countries, the lesser developed countries will face the brunt of this transition more than better people. And that is going to create a lot of social unrest. So in that context, I think that's my second message. We have to rethink how we run the world, and that has 2-3 big dimensions. One is role of governments. I think you will increasingly get to a world where you have to have a lot more activist role of the public sector. That doesn't necessarily mean big government, but it does mean more activist government, because some of the questions we're going to deal with are questions of what makes us human, what makes us philosophically, the question of philosophy. And you need people to help shepherd a common state for society and direction. That's an activist government. I think you need government to catalyze investments. You need government to de-risk investments. That's an activist government. By the way, this is not the first time it's happened. You know, it's happened in the 18th century. In the fiscal sense, it happened with Japan post-World War. It happened with DARPA and NASA driving Silicon Valley in the US. And frankly, I've seen it in Singapore. Singapore is the best case point, activist government. But I think you'll also need a private sector which is a little bit more attuned to what's popularly now called stakeholder capitalism. I.e. a common good agenda, not just a shareholder good agenda. So I think you'll need that to come together. And I think the PPP will be public, private, and people, because the capacity of the individual to have a voice with social media and the new world means the people sector is going to be a relevant sector. One thing I think we need to take away from this when I say manage the world, our current global multilateral institutions are failing us. We will have to come together as one people, and therefore I can see, again, Wang Qishan, a completely new infrastructure and architecture for managing the digital world and the digital economy at a global level, the United Nations for digital. But also I see maybe dialing up within the current infrastructure a new impetus for the green economy and the green world. So I think there are a lot of shifts we need to see in the coming decade.
Well, if I just, I think every time we are in a crisis, people say, this time it's different, and every time we come out of a crisis, one of the strongest features we find in mankind is habit persistence. We go back to our old ways. So I'm much more on the page that, yes, we are in a crisis. Crises usually are best managed by governments because they have unlimited resources and can act fast, and they can actually enforce things. So, and that's why we created states. That's why we created governments. And governments do their job in a crisis. I mean, see Hank in the room. Governments did their job in the financial crisis. Governments will do their job in the pandemic crisis. We had repeated crises in finance. That's why we created a financial crisis infrastructure at the global level with the IMF, the World Banks. We didn't have that in the pandemic world. And we're now moving from pandemic to endemic. We have to start living with viruses globally. And we need to create a kind of infrastructure there. The WTO existed, but it wasn't a global coordinator. And the responses were fragmented, national, even regional. And we locked down systems, we locked down towns. That's not a good response, and I think we need to move to a better place in response. But I think the way we will do business will be influenced by other things than the pandemic. The pandemic has sort of shown us that we're vulnerable on globalization, because now every crisis we had is global by definition. And there will be other global crises. One of the crises that is in the back is the sort of environmental crisis. But I'm a stern believer that through research, development, but also to determined efforts, we get on top of these. So the mega trends that we're seeing that Piyush mentioned, digitalization, the whole sustainability discussion, those will be parts of doing business. They're not external events that influence business. They are part of how we do business, and it has to be put in our business models. And I think that's how we will change, but that's adaptation to the circumstance. And I think that's what mankind has really done all the time. I don't think we're in a new normal. We're just coming out of a really bad situation, and we'll learn our lessons from that and be better in the future.
Axel, I completely agree with you that the government played such a critical role in crisis and is so necessary, and we saw swift action back in spring of 2020. But the private sector did too, and we wouldn't be sitting here together if we weren't all vaccinated and businesses didn't rise to the challenge of heroics to develop vaccines. We saw so many businesses over the past 18 months looking for ways to solve problems, whether they be about sustainability and ESG, or, and from my seat at the New York Stock Exchange, we're seeing companies coming public all the time, many of them providing technologies to address issues that they recognize, whether it be supporting small and mid-sized businesses, or, I see Sarah Fryer out there next door developing communities, because community is such an important part of our recovery. And so all of those things that the private sector is doing are so critical, yet there's such an adversarial relationship between the public sector and the private sector.
No, it's
so
actually it's no contradiction, because what you see is in a situation where you are in a crisis, the government can play a role by coordinating and by intervening. It's as important when you come out of the crisis that the government retreats, that the government lets markets and corporates take over again. We've seen that in the financial crisis. There was a re-regulation, but now the financial industry is actually much stronger than we were before the crisis. So it's a give and take. The government plays a role in a crisis, but if they stay in crisis mode all the time, we're really moving down the wrong track. I agree with you.
I think one thing I wanted to bridge this conversation, I think actually it really depends what country and culture you're in. If you go to Europe, the governments have a much more engaged role in running the society. If you go to America, for example, where it's become a very, the new political agenda is so short-termist in America that the people who are assuming a much bigger role in the society are the very big corporations. And one of the things that's interesting, Stacey, is who are the people that are having the biggest impact on climate and during the vaccine movement? It's actually the employees of the big companies and the pension fund holders of the big companies, because every day the CEO now in the last 2 or 3 years has to deal with activist groups internally. So these groups are having big influence on issues of climate, brown to green, big influence on vaccines, big influence on how the pandemic is managed, and big influence on lifestyle. So I think it varies. And then you go to Asia, where you have a very different dynamic between the governments and the corporations. So I think you can't really generalize. The thing we can't forget, though, and I want to keep this reintroducing the individual here, we have the governments, this whole climate debate, we have the governments and we have corporations. You don't hear enough about what the average person who doesn't want to get left behind, where is that person going to be in terms of getting retrained with digital to all the things that you've been raised?
We have a question here that pertains to what we've already discussed, and I'm going to pose it to the panel. Can we rely on companies to protect the common good through ESG and voluntary compliance, or do we need to ask government to use the mandatory levers of taxes and regulation to accomplish that? Piyush, you were about to say something, so I'm going to throw this to you.
Well, I think the answer is yes and yes. I think without a doubt, the business agenda and company's agenda is morphing, if it wasn't already there. So the round table, the business leaders round table in the US is a case in point. But increasingly, the understanding of having to respond to multiple stakeholders is there on companies, the pension funds, our investors, the NGOs, the marketplace, our consumers, our employees. They're expecting it of us, so you don't have a choice. But by the way, I also have come to this thing that if you think long term, then there's really not that much conflict between your shareholder commitments and other stakeholder commitments. I mean, if you want to give a decent return to your shareholder over 30 years, you'd better be around for 30 years. And the only way you're around for 30 years is you need a license from civil society. So you've got to earn that license. But at the same time, there are other things where it's quite clear to me the public sector is the only way you get to play a role. You want a global tax on carbon. I can tell you no private sector company can create a tax on carbon. You need the government to do that. You need rules around measurements. You need rules around transition pathways. If you don't have an activist public sector role, this will never happen. So as with everything else, we saw that in the financial sector, the GFC. You can leave the market forces completely to themselves, and then it turns out that's inadequate. You need to have stronger, regulations, supervision frameworks. So I think that balance is what we need, and that's why yes and yes. I want to quickly go back, Eric, to this earlier point. I think John was saying this thing right. I think some of the responses of, Do you need active government only in a crisis, or do you need active government all the time? Is a socio-political issue.
I'm going to come back to
Asia,
that.
most places where we are, it has been an activist government, and maybe we can later talk about it. I think Singapore is a small country, 5 million people, but it's a fantastic example for what an activist government can do through cycle, not just in crisis.
I do actually want to come back to that point, but because we're eager to engage the audience, I want to talk about this. I referred to the old paradigm. I gave it a name, globalization, before, but it had a supportive environment, right, of subdued market volatility when we didn't have a financial crisis on our hands, political stability, and of course, low inflation. We have a poll, and I'll bring it up so that you can see it, folks. This is the question: are central banks underestimating inflation? Answer A, yes, there's too much government spending, and monetary stimulus. B, absolutely, it's structural, and we're heading for stagflation. C, no, inflation is a temporary phenomenon linked to supply shocks and worker shortages. So let's give the audience a chance to answer that question. And as they do, panel, how would you have answered the question, Stacey?
I would go with C, but temporary is a subjective term.
Would you prefer transitory?
Well, it's just hard to say exactly how long that'll last.
Piyush.
I don't agree. So I think inflation is getting to be a lot more structural for two or three, the 2 or 3 anecdotal observations. One is a lot of inflation is now wage inflation. I'm seeing wages go up everywhere, not just in the US, but in our part of the world. I was mentioning before, I announced in December that there'd be no wage increases in my company this year. That pronouncement lasted 100 days. I started losing people. We had to, and most of my clients are doing that. So, and wage inflation is sticky. It doesn't go away. Second, the energy issues. As we're trying to disinvest in the fossil fuel economy and shifting, I think there's a structural shift which is going to drive energy price inflation. And on the supply chain, all our clients I talk to at the ports, at the ships and so on, I don't think the supply chain is a 1, 2, 3, 4 month issue. It could be 2, 3, 4 quarters. And what happens is when you start seeing sticker prices of 6 and 7%, that starts building inflationary expectations. And once inflationary expectations get anchored, then you get into the spiral. So I don't think it's such a temporary phenomenon.
John, how would you answer?
Let's remember, inflation's at a 31-year high, at least the data that came out of the United States. It's clearly going to remain high for the foreseeable future. So there's 2 issues. There's one, where is it ultimately going to remain when it does come into some new paradigm normalization? I think this global argy-bargy in terms of supply chains, people reestablishing their models, and the sort of deglobalization is going to continue for several years, probably 3 to 5 years. So it's going to be a period of time where inflation is going to be very volatile. So the issue isn't inflation is going to remain high. The issue is where it's going to reset. Will it reset around 2%, which has been the Fed target, or higher than that? So that's what we should be focusing on.
Axel?
Combination of A and B, except for B, I don't believe we had for stagflation. I think we'll see continued growth. We're going up to our old growth trajectories, but in my view, there is some structural elements that are not just transitory or temporary. And I think we'll have uncomfortably high rates of inflation for 1, 2, 3 years like that. Then it really depends on policy, because if you assume, as in A, that monetary policy and government spending remains extremely expansionary, then I think we get more structural problems that we run into. But if they do their job and normalize policies and normalize spending coming out of the crisis, move to a more normal mode of operation, it can be more short-lived. But I think it really depends on how these levers are moved in the next years.
I'm not sure if we have the results of our poll. I'm sure they'll come up in a moment, and we'll be able to see how all of you in this room, here we go. Do you agree with our panel? Well, our panel had mixed views, and so do you. There we go. Again, I'm going to make reference to the old paradigm. We could call it the old global business model, and make an assertion that it was guided by a singular goal: profit. And there's something of a consensus emerging today that the pursuit of profit not only isn't enough, but also explains why the old business model is variously destroying the planet, creating ever larger wealth gaps, and not delivering on the promise of shared prosperity. Axel, even if you don't agree that there will be a new paradigm, does there need to be a new sense of purpose for the global business?
I think global business needs to really focus on not creating externalities like pollution and global warming. And so clearly the cost of doing business globally, in bringing that back to levels that are sustainable, will have a much increased cost level. So I'm with Piyush, there will be a lot of green inflation in a lot of things we do, and it will hit consumers, and it will also, just a stark reminder, we're talking about distribution and whether there's inequality in our societies. It's not a new phenomenon. Remember, the Communist Party just had its 100th anniversary in China. Marx and Lenin have been 100 years ago transforming political views in Europe. So everything repeats. It just comes back in shorter or longer cycles. So I'm not that excited about it. We'll get on top of these problems. So I don't think we're in a new world. We just see a morphing of the old world into something that looks different, but it's the same underlying thing.
I sort of think we have to keep in mind, this is, I think, the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's sort of definition of the purpose of the corporation and maximizing profit. If you actually read that article carefully, its purpose of the corporation is to maximize profit, comma, all things considered, which gets into this logic that Axel is referring to in terms of what I call stakeholder capitalism, which means the broader purview. And I think we're now living in an environment where people are, and you see this now with the recent Chinese plenum, and you also see this with the big American corporations. They're more focused not on maximizing profit, but what I call stable growth. And stable growth doesn't imply volatility in growth. It implies managed growth over a period of time because they're looking at more long-term R&D, and they've got a number of objectives. So I think you're seeing a shift from more volatile growth to more projected stable growth in the developed world, but also, and that's one of the things the Chinese are equally focused on.
There's a relevant question from the audience here. Given the impressive job done by the private sector, you mentioned this, Stacey, to develop vaccines in record time, given that it required public investment and facilitation, do we also need an Operation Warp Speed to rapidly develop new technologies to address the climate crisis?
Well, it didn't all require public investment. I mean, Pfizer made that decision on themselves, right? So I think that there is that opportunity. I do believe, though, that there is a place for the government to work together with the private sector in a constructive way, less adversarial, so that we can advance those initiatives. And I think it's really important. And when we think about, I just lost my train of thought. I'll let you go.
Well, let me pick up on that. I think R&D is important, and oftentimes, in the pharma industry, the private sector does R&D. You take the internet, a large part of that was driven by DARPA, and the Defense Administration, and then poured out. So there's some areas where R&D, as an example, the public sector can play a critical role. In Singapore, we have an agency called A-Star. We have an R&D budget of about $22 billion for every 5-year period. And we, along with participants from private sector, figure where to put those dollars to work. And a substantial amount of it is now going in things about, how do you think about nature-based solutions, greening the economy, creating institutes of learning, driving the education agenda on some of these subjects. So I think the public sector can play a role.
And they're not in conflict. It can be a commercial opportunity, and to be focused on profit and to be focused on long-term growth and stable growth. And that's the environment I believe we should be fostering. When I think about some of the decisions we've made in our own business, just looking back through time, in 2003, we were investing in environmental markets with the climate exchange that we acquired in 2010 because we thought the importance of that work and also the commercial opportunities that we predicted we were going to see from that. Same logic when we announced our launch of natural asset companies, which provides an opportunity for investors to invest in the natural resources that we want to see become nature positive so that we can have a positive influence. That's a commercial opportunity. It's also a successful endeavor for all of us and mankind. And I believe strongly we should be fostering those projects.
One of the things, Eric, I think we've got to be, and following on what Stacey has said, is the whole ESG area has been managed with the PR point of view as being very negative. Everything is what I call negative ESG, negative climates. Everything is you can't obviously, you've got to constrain coal, you've got to constrain carbon, you've got to constrain methane. But let's be on the offensive side. There's an extraordinary number of industries, the green industries, which are not given enough attention. They're not given enough profile. Many of them are not in America, which is probably why they're not given enough profile. Many of them are in Europe or in Asia, and particularly in China, where there's a big growing business. So I think we need to figure out broader policies to make sure that these companies are given, Stacey, more profile, more capital, more opportunities to expand, and really set aside and given incentives, tax incentives or other incentives, more than what we have now in order to grow. Because this is going to take, the Industrial Revolution took a long time. This is going to take a long time, and we've got to transition this. This isn't about turning off hydrocarbons and turning this on, because this is still very nascent. We need to but we need to focus on the positive side of where the investment needs to be.
Actually, and part of that investment actually is on what you said, John. It is the transition.
Yeah.
You got to get industries to move from brown to light brown to light green, and light green to green. It's not going to go one to the other. So it is a $1 trillion opportunity, absolutely.
Piyush, you started your comments in this conversation talking about how we run the world and the need for activist governments. The rise of crypto embodies a mistrust of institutions, especially monetary institutions and governments, and it embodies the collective desire for decentralization of financial power. How, in the context of this conversation, do you think about decentralization and tools like cryptocurrency?
Well, that's the challenge I alluded to. So, maybe not in this room, but if you talk to any young kid today, you talk to the technocrats, you talk to the evangelists, they will tell you that the future of the world is self-sovereign. 8 billion people, each of us can be sovereign. We have our own identity, it is tokenized, my data is my own, my interactions are own, I will deal in smart contracts, I will have my own currency. So in Web 2.0, the big risk was due debate between the kingdom of Facebook versus the kingdom of Sweden. In Web 3.0, it's not even that. Is it you each become a self-sovereign identity and work with that? And believe me, there's hundreds of millions of people who think that's the future. And which is why I say it's a massive paradigm shift. We're good to think, no, I don't believe that will happen. I think there is a lot vested in cultural identities, nation states, what we've built, the Westphalian democracy. So I don't think it will happen. But it will require us to think very hard on how do we construct a system where a large number of people think, I don't need a government, I don't need a currency, I don't need a fiat currency, I don't need a bank, I don't need a central bank, I don't need a stock exchange. So how do you balance these two and create the artifacts that you need to run the world in the future? Is the right question.
Axel, I want you to jump in here. You've run institutions on the public and the private side. What do you think?
Well, look, you asked about crypto. It's a hybrid, and people usually talk about the hybrid instead of the details. We really like the technology behind that, blockchain technology, distributed ledger, and we do a lot of that trade finance as banks with that. The crypto part is where I'm skeptical, because the whole idea is let's sort of move payments from banks and cash to something that is an anonymous vehicle where both sides of the transactions are not known. That will not survive. The only part where you had that in the old paradigm was banknotes. Governments have phased out large denomination banknotes because they didn't want large transactions with no fingerprint and no ID on it. And crypto, trying to do that in digital, is going to be jumped upon by government as much in the traditional world as it will be in the sort of digital world. So I love the technology. I think the idea of having instantaneous transaction between a large number of people, fantastic, but I think it needs to have a KYC, know your client, an AML procedure around it, otherwise it will not survive. Governments are working hard to avoid illegal activities that could be done through transaction in financial sphere, and governments will not tolerate this to become really big.
The regulation will definitely follow, and governments are definitely going to get involved. But the revolution that drove crypto, I think, gets to John's point about the individuals saying, hey, this system doesn't work for me. They feel left out. And that decentralization, if we don't address those underlying themes of individuals not feeling part of the framework that we've created, we're going to see that conflict continue.
Whether we define it as a new paradigm or an evolution of the old paradigm. I think you all have a much better sense of what the world we're living in today looks like, and what, more importantly, what it's going to look like in the days, the weeks, the months, and years ahead. Please join me in thanking our panel.